What's up YouTube, Capital G here. Today I'm going to be talking about, without a doubt, one of the most important and surprising events from the entire GX era, a story about a shocking tournament win and an even more shocking, unprecedented act by Upper Deck and Yugioh. Today I'm going to tell you about the story of the monster we in the Yu-Gi-Oh community helped create until that monster became too powerful to control and had to be put down permanently. This is the story of the one and only Shonen Jump Championship that was won by the Cyber-Stein OTK deck, and how that win led to Cyber-Stein becoming the first emergency ban card in Yu-Gi-Oh history. Our story starts late 2006. The fateful Shonen Jump San Jose didn't happen until mid-December, but before we get to that, I feel it necessary to get you up to speed on the format and one of the biggest menaces in the game. The format was somewhat diverse, as they were for much of the GX era. Monarchs were an absolute powerhouse. However, you might be shocked to learn that Zaborg, the Thunderstorm Monarch, which by many people's account isn't even a real monarch considering that it's technically level 5, was actually considered to be one of the most potent cards in the deck, considering Rise of the Storm Monarch had not yet been released, and that was coming out in Storm of Ragnarok. Zaborg and Thestalos were the main damage dealers, while Mobius was more or less a side deck card. Monarchs came in a couple of variants, including the Control version, which ran a lot of good standalone cards. This would include stuff like DD Warrior Lady, Gravekeeper Spy, Dakochi the Battle Enchanted Locomotive. Then there was also the Apprentice version, which is often referred to as Apprentice Monarchs. We also had control decks that relied on a lot of one-for-one removal cards like Sakuretsu Armor and Widespread Ruin. This deck ran a lot of solid monsters that could plus easily, like Breaker the Magical Warrior, Spirit Reaper, things of those sort. And the last big contender in the meta was, well, you probably guessed it by now, the Cyber-Stein OTK deck, a deck that centered around doing two things and two things only: stalling until it got all its combo pieces assembled and then putting those pieces into play for one explosive OTK. While the Cyber-Stein OTK was by far the most explosive deck in the meta, it wasn't the most consistent, and losing a key combo piece, for instance, to a Confiscation or a Thestalos could even mean outright losing in some situations. For those reasons, believe it or not, the Cyber-Stein OTK deck was never actually the general consensus to win a Shonen Jump Championship. Beyond those woes, the deck actually had a very bad track record of basically making it all the way to the top 8 of Shonen Jump Championships, then immediately losing, no matter what the matchup was or the pilot of the deck. Whether it was Cesar Gonzalez, a duelist who would later go on to win 2 Shonen Jump Championships during the 5Ds era, he made it to the top 8 of Shonen Jump Philadelphia in July. Robert Morgan, who made top 8 at Shonen Jump Indianapolis in August, but unfortunately was caught with marked Cyber-Steins and was banned from Yu-Gi-Oh! Or even Zach Austin, who finished top 8 at Shonen Jump Durham in February. He actually had the brilliant plan of running a straight up burn deck and then siding into Cyber-Stein OTK to catch his opponents off guard. Obviously, they would side out all their defensive cards and then he would promptly OTK them. It seemed like being a great player, straight up cheating or trying to outsmart your opponent, nothing apparently could get the Cyber-Stein deck over the hump, and it was always stuck in the top 8, despite having half a dozen players actually making it that far. So with all those problems and issues working against it, you might actually have come to believe that Cyber-Stein wasn't that big of a problem, and you would be absolutely wrong. In fact, I'd argue that it was the biggest menace and problem for the entire 2006 calendar year in Yu-Gi-Oh! How could it be such of a problem if the deck never won at the highest level, you might wonder? Well, the answer is actually quite simple, but if you weren't playing the game at the time, it's not something you might actually think of. It's what we used to refer to as the random Stein. You see, Cyber-Stein wasn't exclusively used in its OTK deck. Cyber-Stein was actually so ridiculously powerful for most of the year that the card was splashed in just about everything. Monarchs, Dark World, Machine, Burn, you name it, and Stein was in it. And I'm not talking about random decks that you saw at locals. I'm saying that these versions were good enough to make top 8 at Shonen Jump Championships. The concept was incredibly simple. Cyber-Stein was searchable from Sangan and could be easily special summoned from the deck with Last Will, so you never actually had to run more than one copy of it. If you were unlucky and you went second, even if it got taken out of your hand with Thestalos or Confiscation, that really wasn't a problem because you would just forget about the Cyber-Stein and you'd play your Dark World or Monarch deck as you would normal. However, if you caught your opponent in a turn where they weren't playing defense that well, instead of actually just doing massive damage with something like Thestalos, the Firestorm Monarch, Cyber-Stein would instead just straight up end the duel by summoning a Cyber Twin Dragon and hitting them for massive damage. Cards like Premature Burial were also legal back then, and Brain Control was completely unlimited, so getting that extra bit of damage without using your normal summon, as you had committed that for Cyber-Stein, was never actually a problem either. The Random Stein was in fact the reason that Cyber-Stein became the most hated card in all of Yu-Gi-Oh, because it basically warped the format into one where the potential punishment for not playing defense effectively on any given turn was automatic death. Against a high-powered offensive deck or an OTK-based one, you might expect that, but when a slow flip effect-based Monarch deck could randomly OTK you because they top-decked Heavy Storm and blew away your Mirror Force and Torrential Tribute, that's when everybody in the community started to acknowledge that we had a problem on our hands. This is one of the only formats that I can actually remember that no matter what deck you were actually dueling against, it always felt like you were on the razor's edge. To make things even worse, during this time in GX, Monster Negation was essentially non-existent and hand traps weren't really a thing yet either. If you also consider that even if your opponent drew Cyber-Stein when they were under 5,000 life points, we had cards in the game like Card Destruction and Graceful Charity that could easily alleviate that problem. The only true commonly played counter to Cyber-Stein was really Ring of Destruction, but that was a non-searchable limited card, so it was hardly what I would call reliable. Leading into Shonen Jump San Jose, which was going to be the last major event of the year, Shonen Jump Anaheim saw an astounding 6 out of the top 8 duelists play Cyber-Stein in the main or side deck, and just to paint the picture a little more clearly, only one of those duelists was actually running the Cyber-Stein OTK. That was the power of the Random Stein. It wasn't just in top cuts at high level events. About 80% of Yu-Gi-Oh decks in the game, regardless of their makeup, were actually running the card. When San Jose finally arrived, we pretty much expected the norm from day 2, but that was far from what we got. The second place build was admittedly the standard par for the course. It was a 1-for-1 control deck with a few Monarchs, of course, the predictable Random Stein, and a bunch of monsters that you were used to seeing all over the meta, but to everybody's shock, the Stein OTK had finally done the impossible and taken first place at the event. Stein OTK wasn't alone in the cheese, with Cyberdark Impact being released a month earlier and a whole slew of new burn cards to play around with. 2 chain burn decks actually made top 8 as well. Ironically, they both sided in the Stein OTK, while David Rodriguez, who actually ended up winning the event, sided in the chain burn. Go figure. This strategy, as you might imagine, made it extremely difficult to side against either deck, and considering that they could both easily run some of the same cards that could be used for stall and burn, cards like Gravity Bind, Magic Cylinder, and Level Limit Area B, it sometimes made it incredibly difficult to even identify what deck you were playing against. While Stein OTK finally breaking through and winning a Shonen Jump championship might not seem like a big deal because, hey, it's just another tier 1 deck finally taking the gold, this one was particularly different. For the first time in the game's history, a dedicated OTK deck had won at the highest level of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! While some might argue that this wasn't necessarily the best look for the game to have happen, we in the community just figured, alright, well, we're basically stuck with Stein for another 3 months. After all, the TCG and the OCG had 100% identical ban lists at the time, and it wasn't set to change until March 2007. And then it happened, the unprecedented first ever Yu-Gi-Oh! Emergency ban list. Just 4 days after San Jose concluded, Dan Snyder, a game designer for the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG who worked for Konami Research and Development, put out an official memo to all Yu-Gi-Oh! Judges declaring that effective immediately, Cyber-Stein was now forbidden. This was incredible. This was unheard of. It sent shockwaves throughout the entire community. This was the first time ever that a card was not just moved in between forbidden and limited list official updates, but this also marked the first time that the TCG had something limited or forbidden that the OCG had not. In fact, according to many sources, Upper Deck actually did this without even contacting Konami, and many people actually believe that this forced Konami and the OCG to actually ban Cyber-Stein on the March 2007 list so that our list would actually coincide and match up perfectly. Now, it goes without saying that this was obviously a big relief for many players out there, as they wouldn't have to deal with the random Stein or really the Cyber-Stein OTK, but there were still out there who couldn't help wonder if this emergency banning thing was kind of like opening Pandora's box. And this is pretty much where our story ends, especially in the TCG where Cyber-Stein is still banned to this day. So let me know what you guys thought of this Yu-Gi-Oh story. It is one of my favorites, especially considering I remember playing back during those GX days, and oh my goodness, Cyber-Stein was, oh man, that was absolutely the card of the year. And I remember it was just so crazy because when the deck finally broke through and won the YCS and it stopped all the memes, just 4 days later the card got emergency banned, and we didn't even know what an emergency banning was. It was something that was just completely unheard of, and we were like, wait a minute, does this mean that the TCG and the OCG are gonna have different ban lists? And man, a lot of people had no idea what was going on at the time. So whatever you guys think, leave it in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching. As always, subscribe if you have not already. Turn on that notification bell for daily videos.